Jeremy Bettle, welcome to the Pacey Performance Podcast. It's a pleasure to chat to you.
Rob, it's an honour to be on, mate.
No, thank you for coming on, and pleasantly surprised. Obviously, I knew you were a Brit, but pleasantly surprised that you went to university up near my neck of the woods at Leeds Beckett.
Yeah, had a great time up in Leeds. Had 3 years up there and thoroughly enjoyed my time.
Yeah, nice. And I was saying to you just before we hit record that I don't think I've had anyone on the podcast who has got the breadth and experience in so many different sports as you. There's a few up there who've got maybe three or four, but the list is as long as your arm with the sports that you've been involved in, which is predominantly the main reason that I wanted to talk to you and go down that route and have a little chat about your experiences. So thank you very much for coming on. But anyone that doesn't know who you are, would you mind just giving us a brief background on you and what you're currently doing?
Yeah, so as you said, I went to university back in the UK, up in Leeds. Graduated with an undergrad back in 2002. And then worked at David Lloyd's in Leicester for a year and found it rather unfulfilling and just thought, with a degree in exercise science, there's got to be more to it than training your average Joe. So I ended up coming over to the States to do my master's. Went to Middle Tennessee State, just outside Nashville. While I was there, they asked me to stay on and do my PhD. So I agreed to do that, much to the annoyance of my wife. And then, from there, got a contact with USA Rugby. And that was sort of the first thing that kicked the ball off rolling to my career here. So worked for USA Rugby through the 2007 World Cup. Then went out to Santa Barbara and worked in private practice physical therapy for a little bit. Basically, because I realized that I didn't know anything about that realm and my athletes were going to be injured at all times, basically. And I was going to have to learn more formally how to sort of modify their programs, keep them training, because they're not necessarily missing games, but they're going to be out. So then from there, once I got some experience with Hayashida and Associates, I went over to UC Santa Barbara, where I was the head strength coach. Had a wonderful few years there. Oversaw 20 teams. I think it's 11 different sports. I'd probably count that as my top experience in sport. You're seeing so much volume of athletes. You're seeing all sorts of variety. And while I was there, did some work with P3 down in Santa Barbara there with Marcus Elliott. And finished up my PhD there with him. We looked at reactive agility. And then I was really fortunate, working with Marcus, got introduced to Darren Williams while he was playing for the Utah Jazz. He then got traded out to the Nets. They were still in New Jersey at the time. And he and Marcus had been talking about placing a strength coach out there, and I was fortunate enough to be that person. So moved out to Jersey with 4 days notice and took my wife from sunny California to New Jersey in the middle of January for about an 80 degree about 80 degree temperature swing. So that wasn't ideal, but that started the ball rolling. So into pro sport for the NBA. Spent 4 years with the Nets. Then got a call if I was interested in the Director of Sports Science and Performance job with the Toronto Maple Leafs up in the NHL, which was just a spectacular opportunity at a monster organization. After 4 years there, got a call from the Anaheim Ducks, and did I want to come and sort of replicate what I'd done in Toronto out in Anaheim. And then after a couple of years, right after COVID, sort of shifted priorities a little bit to focus a little more on Michelle and I and have some time at home, and moved over to the MLS with New York.
Nice.
And here we are.
Absolutely. No, it's such an interesting story. The recruitment of the position that you ended up filling, was that through David?
Yes. So,
okay. Yeah.
So Dave Slemon was involved in that process. Sort of a funny story. I'd been introduced to David Lee, the sporting director here, a couple of months prior through a mutual friend of ours, and we were having some discussions, and he was starting to frame out that performance director role, and so when the job came available, he sort of floated the idea that maybe I would be interested, not thinking necessarily that I would be, and so yeah, let's give it a go. The timing was right, and it worked out really well. So yeah, then Dave and I know one another. Dave Slemon and I know one another anyway, so he connected us and started the process.
Nice. Yeah, Dave's been on the podcast. His podcast went down a storm. It was such an interesting take on recruitment from the other side, from the recruiter side. Obviously, that area is booming, especially people at the level that you're talking about and that you're at. But just getting some insights into what recruiters are actually looking for, what employers are actually looking for, and then try to filter that down the system to, your head strength coaches or your assistant strength coaches, and just get an insight and hints and tips from Dave, who's looking at this from obviously the side, to help those practitioners out there. So it went down a storm. Yeah.
And Dave's great too, and he's so personable and sort of wanting to help more than anything, So he and I have sort of go back quite a way, with our relationship. So yeah, it's great.
So the first thing I want to dive into is there's been lots of transitions between roles, between different sports. That may be something that puts people off in the transition from a rugby to a football, or in your case, from an ice hockey to a football or to a soccer, and how you actually go about making that transition, having not been a football guy or a basketball guy or an ice hockey guy. What's your process when you get even thinking about making a jump to a different sport, and then what does that process look like once you're there?
Yeah, it's actually my favorite scenario to be in is moving sport. I think that's when I'm sort of at my best. And I know it's the right move because I'm scared to death. You're absolutely terrified because it's a brand new culture, all new norms, customs, just traditions within the sport. So it's a really intimidating process. But it's one that we're really fortunate to have available to us as practitioners on the performance and medicine side, is that our skill sets are sort of agnostic, right? And so I think you've got to approach it with that confidence that if you're a sports coach, you're really stuck into your sport. If you're at the top, there's only a handful of jobs for you. For us, we get to be in that bigger pool. So it starts out, I think, with a belief that you can do it. And then as you sort of build your practice, I think you go from everything being really, really complicated to actually quite simple. You start boiling it back down. And when you look at that, I think that there are huge similarities, and if you look at the sports themselves, basketball and ice hockey really couldn't be much more different. Everything being vertical for the most part in basketball and entirely lateral in ice hockey. But the big rocks of athleticism are sort of the same. You've got tall athletes moving sideways, right? And so when you're training for that trait and you analyze the sport and you pull out those sort of biomechanical motions that are predominant in that sport, and you just look to train them. Right? And so it's not as complicated as I think we can make it out in our head. And it's certainly not as complicated as people who've only been within one sport think it is. Everybody likes to think their sport is special and unique. And, I know like you do squats in hockey, but, that's not football.
It's different,
yeah. Yeah, it's different in football.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a very intimidating process to start with, but I find that somewhat more from a cultural perspective, and that learning curve initially is absolutely immense, but that's what I enjoy about it. You get to go in with a fresh set of eyes, no preconceived notions, and you get to slowly over time just see where your philosophies can plug in, and where you can identify gaps and bring things from other experiences that you've had to enhance an already really good system.
Has there been any examples that you can think of, reflect on your own path when you're diving into these different sports, where you've tried to bring a previous methodology, previous thought process into a new organization that hasn't worked? It's worked in this environment, so you've thought, great, it'll work in this one, and it's flopped or not gone as well as you thought. Can you explain any examples of that to us?
Absolutely. And where I think that happened to me, it was probably not moving sport, but moving within a sport. Because I think there's a level of complacency when you go within a sport that it's just going to be the same. And so I sort of went in and sort of, I thought you'd just be able to take the system that I'd spent 4 or 5 years building and just start. It'd be year 5, but in the new place, and forgot all the work that I'd done year 1, year 2, year 3 to compound those effects to get to where we were, which was a really elite system by the time we were up and running. But the new environment just wasn't even close to ready for it, right? And so then you walk in and you think, oh, so much low-lying fruit here. I can just start picking it off quick, like day 1, start making changes. And you walk into a group of people who don't actually know that there's change needed yet. And then you start sort of moving everything around and people get defensive. And now you're sort of behind the 8 ball a little bit in terms of you're trying to dig yourself out of a hole because you've immediately come in and put people's guards up.
I've got a little question off the back of that. Just write it down so I don't forget. Interesting. So you moved into an organisation and you're the change because you've been brought in, but the people in the organisation or the organisation as a whole doesn't know that the change is needed or doesn't think the change is needed. How do you attack that? Or no, attack is probably the wrong word. How do you tackle that?
Usually people think it's someone else that has to change within the organization. You know, I sort of told that to James Morton the other day on a chat we had with that people are generally excited for someone else to change when you go into an organization. Oh, the medical guys, yeah, they really need to get their stuff together. Or the strength coach is terrible, you know. And so how I approach it now is different than how I did at that point. You know, just sort of gangbusters, go in and try and make that change fit just right away, just start telling people how we were going to change things. Essentially, my job is a change management process as much as it is a performance director's role where you're really addressing performance, because you're dealing with people who are at the top of their game and have been at the top of professional sport for a long time and have had a lot of success with the way they've been doing things. And so for me now, the process is more to go into an environment and sit back and observe for a little bit. Now, it depends very much on the organization, how much time they'll give you. You know, certain places they're demanding results the day you get hired. Other places, like here in New York, it was a slower process for me. I came in mid-season, which makes it easier for you to come in and not make changes. And so for the first 30 days, I really didn't do anything on the job. I just sort of watched and observed. And what that allowed me to do was see the things that were going really well. You know, and that's something I've missed previously in coming in and trying to change day one and make it my system. You miss that richness that you're getting from the quality of the practitioners you're moving into. And then what you can do is start slowly plugging in areas that you think you can help and sort of be a force multiplier rather than just sweep everything out and here's what we're doing. And it also creates a sense that it's our program as opposed to it's my program. I'm coming in and delivering this to you and I'm going to take all the credit for it. Or I'm going to blame you when it doesn't work, you know. And so I think that has helped these change processes go much better when we sit down and we actually create them together. And we don't flush down the toilet all the stuff that people are doing really well.
So the first 30 days, you were given the opportunity to watch and observe. In this current role, what would the next 30 days look like? So up to 60 days and then up to 90 days.
So up to 60, you're starting to look at the subtle changes that, because again, we were in season, so I didn't want to change too much right away that was going to create big changes in the athletes' routines, particularly as we build up to game day. So starting to address things like any concerns we have with the nutrition, the menu, things that are changing behind the scenes that are sort of happening to the athlete versus them having to actually participate in. Starting to design that environment a little better around the training facility. One of my philosophies around that is that the athlete sort of jumps in the river at the front door and they flow through the system that you've got them in, and it sort of happens to them. And so we'll
come back to that because I'd love to get some more detail on that. We'll come back. Yeah. I'm telling you, which is a reminder to me. So sorry, mate. Carry on.
So they sort of flow through this river. And when you look at like Richard Thaler's work that he got the Nobel Prize for Economics on behavioral economics, it's designing the environment to sort of tilt the board your way and help them make better decisions, so that they're in your system and they have to try very hard to not be, because the whole environment is sort of designed to keep them within it. So these are little things that we can do just to have the environment happen to the athlete. And then we start, with guys who may be out injured, we start looking at how are we progressing them through a rehabilitation program? Because those guys we can change quite a lot for quite quickly. And so really establishing some very good, very objective rehabilitation processes. Really integrating performance in medicine and sports science and nutrition, making sure that it's a multidisciplinary approach to every problem that we're trying to solve. And then as we go into that 90 days, and it's more of a sort of graded curve than it's okay, at 90 days we're doing this. We just start tweaking how the athletes are starting to do things, right? So whether it's we create an appointment-based schedule in the training room, right? And we see every athlete every week, regardless of whether they're injured or not. We have some objective parameters that we're going to assess the injury risk factors against. All right, and so these are the sort of changes that we make. And then once we get to the off season, now we can make big changes. So when they walk back into the facility, they see and feel a change in the environment.
Let's go back to what that environment and what the environment looks like, and how you change things, alter things so they flow through that river the way that you want them to make better decisions. So when they enter the training facility, what kind of alterations are you making to make that do what you want it to do? I think this would be a really interesting one for people, because I think they may assume, or I would assume, that when someone like you comes in, it's doing the things like you said, 60 to 90 days will be the first things that you want to do. You want to make changes that everyone can see, not for the fact that everyone can see it, but it's the things that may make the difference now. But actually, this environmental piece is something that's going to impact everything moving forwards for the 30, 60, 90, 1 year, 2 years. So I think it'd be interesting for people to see what tweaks you make on this front.
Yeah, so for me, it's about what order do you want things to happen in? And so I think we got this really... I was fortunate coming into New York in that the city football group have put a lot of thought into environmental design and into the sort of makeup and the flow of the practice facility. But in Toronto, we sort of crafted it to where you'd come in and you'd already done, maybe it was your wellness questionnaire. That was the first piece on your phone. And so we knew what was going on when people come in. And then as you come in to the building, we set up we built a kitchen and set up a nice lounge and made it an environment where people were attracted to, put in really nice coffee machine and this sort of stuff. And then we hired a chef. And this was a 4-year process. I didn't come in like in the first 30 days and build a kitchen. But we hired a chef who was an elite chef, but very interested in sort of performance nutrition. And so we crafted the menu to fuel whatever the day of activity was or what the week looked like. But then we also sourced food from the local Mennonite community, right? And so it was grass fed beef. It was, all organic. And so you've got these beautiful foods that are going to fuel the athlete, but more than that, it's going to build the athlete's body. I think we turn over every cell in the human body every 2 years. We're building new humans, right? So we sort of guide them through that, and you've got a nice omelet station, and we're sort of fueling them for the day. And then from there, they sort of flow into the change room, get changed, and into the training room where they have their appointments. And then from there, they flow directly into the weight room where they all have an individualized corrective program based on the screening we'd do. They have a warm-up that they'll do that's individualized. Then we'd go into the lift, which we'd do as a group with some individualization within it. But for the most part, it was a group lift. And then they go through into the meeting and then out onto the ice. And again, it just created a flow, even down to the equipment guys in Toronto who had put a little trash can next to each guy's locker, so they weren't throwing tape into the middle and it was all over the place. Just it was right next to you. Just really, really small details like that were really well crafted to keep the place looking nice as well. Because we just thought, and this came from our president Brendan Shanahan, if the guys see the place looking really nice and clean and well kept and orderly, they will keep it looking like that, and they'll respect it. And that's what we wanted it to be, an environment that was sort of about excellence and about them respecting the environment and the club and the history. So we made sure that was very, very present within the club.
One thing I'm conscious of is that there'll be 99.9% of listeners won't be in a position like yours, although extremely interesting. They're probably trying to understand, okay, I'm going to be a new member of staff in an organization, but I'm not going to be at director level. I'm going to be at assistant level, or I'm going to be a regular strength coach or whatever that may be, but still want to go in and put their own tweak on things, make little changes here and there, just like you did, but at very much a higher level. What would your advice be to those who want to make a change but want to be conscious of the current regime and all that kind of stuff, and obviously answering to their superiors of what can be changed and what can't? So what would be your advice when it comes to going into a new role, new organization, new sport, and trying to put their own stamp on it?
I think your statement there on a very clear understanding of what can be changed and what can't. One of the things that's sort of core to my philosophy is we spend very little time worrying about what we can't change. And then within your own environment, that's what you're responsible for ultimately. That was my space in Brooklyn. I was the strength coach, and that weight room, the atmosphere in there, which was one where athletes could come in and feel comfortable to vent and share and hang out as well as get their work in. How we crafted that to optimize the workouts we were doing, whether it was changing out equipment, getting new. That was the piece I controlled. And then building the relationships with your co-workers in other departments to create influence. and not through coming in and telling them how it should be done, but understanding their role, understanding where they can help you and you might be able to help them, and sort of, again, working to co-create some programs and create change together, versus coming in with the answers, which I've certainly been guilty of. But then you get to work with the nutritionist, you get to work with the psychologist, right? And you get to build a multidisciplinary program yourself, through your own relationship skills versus having the authority to just come in and say, no, this is changing.
You mentioned philosophy there and what your philosophy is. Always interested to hear what people's philosophies are and how they articulate them, especially when there's a little red button flashing there. Well, it's not actually flashing, but the time's going up because we're recording. How people do that in this environment. So how would you describe your philosophy? What is your philosophy?
Overall, I think it is a multidisciplinary approach to complex problem solving, in a nutshell. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Essentially, I don't buy into any of this. Injuries are a part of sport. We can't improve an athlete's nutrition. We can't control what they do away from the rink, the court. Our job at the elite level is to be elite practitioners, and mostly that involves education, and we're not necessarily limited by our technical knowledge, but our application of that knowledge becomes limited. So I think if we identify problems that we want to solve, in Toronto, we wanted to go after groin injuries. You can identify through the research what are the key risk factors, and every single person on that multidisciplinary team can impact at least one of those risk factors, whether it's a range of motion, whether it's strength, whether it's ratios and imbalance. Everybody can impact something, and then it's about the group coming up with a systematic way to approach that, from the nutrition when they walk in the door, all the way through medical, all the way through strength and conditioning, through your sports science staff and how they're monitoring everything, through your coaching staff and how you're creating influence with the coach, because they're going to have an impact on that injury prevention program. And so you as a group work to solve that problem. No one person can solve it on their own, and you certainly can't solve it as separate silos. So yeah, I think that's the core of it, is everybody attacking a problem from their perspective, monitoring that process, and adjusting based on the outcomes.
So like you said, in Toronto, you went after groin injuries. Is that because they were higher than what you would ideally want, and they were the kind of thing that you wanted to focus on?
Yep, they were quite high coming in, and it's the big injury in hockey. If you think everything's lateral in hockey, so you take a footballer's legs and you turn them around, and the glute becomes the quad, and the adductor becomes the hamstring, right? And that's the injury, basically. So we wanted to take that on, and we did in a systematic way, and we had an unbelievable staff, and so we ended up going about 3.5 years without having a non-contact injury, which you do it for a year, and everyone says how lucky you've been with injuries, and you do it for a couple of years, and these guys might be doing something back there. And then you go 3 years, and okay, yeah, the system's working, right? So it's something that you always aspire to, and we, of course, we had our share of luck, but it's a testament to the work that my team and my practitioners were doing on the ground. And we were being impactful because we were only going after those things we knew we could change.
I know this wasn't the focus of the conversation, but I think we should dive in, given the success that you guys had at Toronto with that particular issue that you faced when you went in. What were the details? What did you change? What did you implement to try to prevent and successfully prevent groin injuries. And is that something that you can then, I know it's a different sport, I know it's a different team, different organisation, but is there elements of that you can take into what you're doing now with football players, soccer players?
Yeah, of course. And it's all just about the underlying principles. So our physical therapist up in Canada, his name's Ryan Morrison, just an unbelievably smart and detail-oriented physio. The first off-season, we had him do a big research project and a lit review around the risk factors for groin injuries. And so that was the foundation is, okay, let's identify the parts of the problem. So he came back and presented to the group. And from there, we created our groin monitoring program. So we identified a series of tests that we were going to do every 1 to 2 weeks with our players. Maybe we would have goalies and defensemen 1 week and we'd have forwards the next, and we'd just alternate them. And we just started building a data set around that. And if somebody was really, really tight, we weren't all that concerned about it, so long as it was normal for them. We didn't like extremes, and we didn't like asymmetries. And so we started working to correct those initially. And then started just working that program of, okay, so we do our groin monitoring at the start of the week, and that guided our intervention so we could identify red flags, which ended up being sort of a standard deviation change one way or the other in any of the tests. And so then we knew ahead of time, because we weren't waiting for it to become pain, we were treating them every week. So if a guy's internal rotation started to tighten up, we would address that day. And the physio would address it in the training room. And then the strength coach would address it in the weight room to give them strength through that new range. And then we might flag to the coach, hey, we don't want him to stay out on the ice too long after practice. And so we'd allow that change to sort of happen. And so just approaching it in that systematic manner and making sure we were regularly monitoring it gave us the ability to head a lot of stuff off at the pass. And then over the years, as we built up that database around those injuries, it just gave us more confidence in it, right? And more sensitivity to change. We sort of boiled it down from some factors we didn't think were being very impactful. And we started seeing things like anyone who tested in the bottom 30th percentile, every time there was a spike in load, they had pain in their adductors, right? And so we knew that those guys coming into training camp were going to be key guys that we needed to improve groin strength. So little things like that just allowed us to have daily intervention and monitoring. And then the buy-in of the coach to not have them on the ice for 2.5 hours, and all these little things. It's everybody doing something rather than me coming in and saying, okay, here's what we're going to do.
When you're tackling big issues like that, is a lit review always the first place to start, or from someone on the team? And what are the next steps? I know in this instance, your groin monitoring program came out the back of it, but is there any other places you would go to gather the intel so you could make a decision what the program, what the next step is going to be? So lit reviews one. What will be the next one?
Yeah. Look, we have a lot of collective wisdom within the group, always, right? And so maybe people haven't always been given time or a voice, right? So if a certain person knows that this is something that's important, but the coach has never really prioritized it, then it doesn't matter what you know, right? So we tried to create the space and time for everybody to do their role, and we also gave everybody a voice. One of the first things we did there was create morning meetings with the entire multidisciplinary team, and give everybody a voice as we reviewed each player on the roster. That's typically not the case when I've gone into a place that's been happening. So that's really important, allowing your really high-level practitioners to do their job. Working on buy-in to the program that you put together with the players and with the coaching staff and management. And so they can sort of back and reinforce it, whether it's making certain things mandatory or, whatever that might look like. And then reaching out to subject matter experts. When in your lit review, you'll see certain names coming up over and over again, and making sure that you're reaching out to them, and you maybe send them your program, like ask for a review of your program. You ask them to present to your staff. These things that we must never think we've got all the answers, because there are people out there in the world who study just this one problem that you're trying to take on, right? And you're trying to build it into this complex environment that you're in. So you must always seek those people out. And then I think the other thing is not getting caught up in being perfect. None of my programs are perfect. You'd probably look at them and think they were terrible. But they work in the environment, right? We have to find the best bad way of doing things often in pro sport. Whether you're on the road with an NBA team and the only space to do a workout is next to the urinals, which that's a true story. So you do it, right? You try and do as much as you can, but you can be paralyzed by the environment because it's so imperfect. When you're playing 4 times a week, you can go away from lifting because you don't want you guys to be tired. Your sleep's never optimal. So you can find so much wrong with the programs. But if you don't start, you'll never do it. And if you wait for it to be perfect, you'll never start.
Mm-hmm. I was speaking to someone who was a head strength coach at a Premier League football club here, and he'd come into a new manager had come into the club, and it wasn't a particularly great culture when it came to lifting. And his request from the coach was just be in the weight room once a week, just be there. You don't have to do anything, but it just shows the players that this is valued by the whole team. And he said that changed the game, completely changed the game. Didn't have to say anything, just was there 15 minutes talking to players, disappeared, but it showed that he cared about that particular session, which then the players changed their tune on that kind of thing. So I just want to change direction a little bit, transitioning from a practitioner role to a leadership role. And I don't know if it was again on the list that you spoke to James about in these last couple of weeks, but it's something that everyone goes through as they progress through their career, particularly in our field, when there's not 30 different rungs on the ladder. There's maybe 3 or 4. You quickly get in, well, not quickly, but you can quickly get into a position where you're not in front of athletes and you're in this more leadership role. And that's often the best strength coach becomes a leader, but he's the best strength coach, he's not the best leader. So how do you, it could be, but maybe not. So how do you make that transition? What things do you put in place? Where do you go for influence? Where do you go to upskill? All these kind of questions that come into my mind when we're talking about this kind of transition.
Yeah. So it's a really challenging one. But I think number one, when you move into a leadership role, especially if you're no longer like the head strength coach when you're going to be doing a bit of work, you're not a practitioner anymore. And you must hire good people and you must let them do their job. Number one. Many new leaders fail in their first roles because they try and do all of the jobs. And you've sort of matriculated up to the top of your field. So it's on you to find somebody who you trust to do the job, which I've been very fortunate to Matt Herring was with me all the way from UC Santa Barbara. He went off to the Spurs. I went to the Nets, and then we teamed back up at the Maple Leafs. And just someone that I trusted implicitly to run that program for me. Hiring a good physio, it's that knowledge that you aren't the expert in all of these fields anymore, right? You need to know what you need and who can do it. Your job is to empower those people and get the resources for them that they need to execute the overall strategy. I think it's super important that you get yourself a coach, because often you're in that position because you're the best strength coach, not because you're the best leader, as you said. We do a very poor job of formally educating leadership. We focus a lot on being a practitioner, on your skill set. And so having a coach who can help you identify your blind spots, help you identify your defaults, improve your communication, improve your leadership. You've got to actively work on becoming a really good leader, because it's not something that we're taught, and just being a good strength coach isn't good enough anymore. And so you've got to learn how to more formally mentor people, because essentially that's your job, is to have your staff replace you. So yeah, it's a difficult process, and your relationships change. You're not the person the athletes will come to anymore. When they're going through a separation or when they're having a hard day, because you've moved one step closer to management. Often you're just a little more at arm's length, and so those relationship changes that happen are quite difficult psychologically, but you've just got to sort of get used to them, and understand that that's just the nature of the role you've moved into.
Would there be any resources that you've either gone through or heard them recommended that people listening could investigate, because at some point they may be looking to move into a leadership role? Is there anything out there that you would put them onto?
Yeah, the work I've done, through my Leaders in Sport membership has been huge for me. I've had a life coach for probably 12 years now. Invested pretty significant amount of my own money in that, just because it's an investment in myself.
So that's personally, crosses personal and professional?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Everything from pure psychotherapy, taking you through, some really difficult times in your life, all the way through how do you deal with the relationships and the dynamics at work. If you've got a really difficult coaching staff in terms of personality, and you're not very strong in confrontation, if you want the job, you're going to have to be in those environments, right? And so you have to get better in those environments. And so you can practice becoming better at that, and you can be taught how to do that. So I think finding a coach or a mentor, and investing in yourself is huge. And there are leadership courses out there, that Harvard Business School do some great online leadership courses, and it's not around sport. We have to stop thinking now we need a sports leadership course. No, just go out there and find leadership, because the principles are the same no matter what.
I know a little bit pushed for time, so I'm going to ask you one more question. I think it's going to be, I hope it's going to be a good one. From your perspective, being the position you're in, obviously making hires, is there any particular gaps? And we're talking about practitioners now, so strength coaches, sports scientists, could be physios, could be any of this performance staff. Any particular gaps that you see in skill sets that need to be plugged and people can upskill in so they can plug them for someone like you in the future? And what is the next thing? What is the next expectation for staff coming into roles like those? 2 questions in one.
I think communication is a critical piece, Because as I said, we become very good at our jobs, become very technically savvy. We know a lot about what we do. And we sort of assume that the athlete's knowledge is sort of coming with ours. So how do you communicate to someone who knows absolutely nothing about what you do and doesn't, frankly, care about it all that much? You know, athletes like playing their sport. They're not exercise science students. So how do you articulate and how do you create behavior change? And then I think being able to stay within the fundamentals and use that as a foundation for innovation, rather than as you innovate moving away from the fundamentals. You know, I think that's a really critical piece is really building on top of core fundamental traits, you know, whether it's strength, power, athleticism. You know, we sort of get off in the weeds a little bit. So I think that those are probably gaps that are sort of emerging. And then there's still a staggering lack of interest in nutrition and psychology within some professional sports. Not all of them, not all clubs. But there's a lack of value placed on it by clubs. So I think, again, these are nutrition and psychology are such core fundamental pieces of performance that before we start getting into the future of, you know, the human being 2.0, I think sometimes the answer is still inside the box, and we've got to solve the problems that can be very, very impactful right away. But then, that's where I think we need to go and keep working to build resilience within our athletes and robustness and having them be able to withstand the demands of their sport rather than protect them from those demands. So this is where I think we'll come back to.
Jez, superb. We've come to the hour. We're 3 minutes past the hour. So I was kidding at the start that I'd keep you to the hour. But where can people find out more about you, about the work that you're doing in New York, wherever it, previous work, PhD, all that kind of stuff?
I don't do a lot in the public space, so maybe a bit on LinkedIn. I'll retweet some stuff on Twitter every now and then. You can see some pictures of my cat on Instagram.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Dr. Jeremy Bettle on Twitter, Jeremy Bettle on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
That's usually the best spots.
Superb. Jez, have a good rest of the day. Stay on, we'll have a little chat after, but officially, thank you very much, and look forward to keeping in touch.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on, Rob.
Thanks, mate.